welcome. And welcome to the University of Kent and to this open lecture sponsored by the Department of Religious Studies in the School of European Culture and Languages. My name is Ward Blanton, and I'm a reader in biblical cultures and European thought here in the department. My colleagues and I are very pleased that you're here this evening. And for those we don't know yet, we look forward to meeting you afterwards, maybe over a drink. And we're even going to try to get the lights turned on. I know that many of you have come here from other disciplines and other academic and also non-academic institutions, and also from several local activist communities to hear Professor Martin's talk. On that score, I'd like to say, first of all, that you're in the right place. Biblical studies, religious studies at the University of Kent is a place where we're trying to invent new and influential forms of interdisciplinary and interinstitutional agendas through collaborative work. We want to address more provocatively and also more profoundly some of the contemporary academic and social problems from which, alas, we will not escape. In such a venture, we welcome all who find with us important new forms of intellectual enthusiasm and new forms of collaborative potential. It's with such things in mind that I can begin to thank Dale Martin for being here with us. This evening, it's his work which provokes and enables such a significant work to rethink where we are today, and we're very grateful that he accepted our invitation to kick off some new and interdisciplinary and also interinstitutional developments in the comparative study of the ancient and contemporary family. For most here, Dale Martin needs no introduction, given the way we're always peddling your books.
Thanks.
Nevertheless, Professor Martin is Woolsey Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University, and this year he's also the Danforth Visiting Professor of Theology at St. Louis University. Dale specializes in work on the New Testament and on the still vexed and politically loaded question of Christian origins. In this work, Dale is known for paying particular attention to the social, sexual, and cultural history of the Greco-Roman world as affording an exemplary way to understand early Jewish and Christian histories. Dale's many books include Sex and the Single Savior, Gender, Sexuality, and Biblical Interpretation, Slavery as Salvation, The Corinthian Body, Inventing Superstition from the Hippocratics to the Christians, Pedagogy of the Bible, An Analysis and Proposal, New Testament History and Literature, and if it's not tacky to say, by my count, the online lecture course accompanying this book has been viewed more than 1 million times. Unless that's just you clicking.
Yeah, I click on it all the time.
He's edited several books, including with Patricia Cox Miller, The Cultural Turn in Late Ancient Studies, Gender, Asceticism, and Historiography. As his work is often implicitly comparative and engaged with contemporary cultural struggles, it's no surprise to me that he's recently engaged head-on with the massive question of the ongoing significance of biblical legacies. This book, which appeared just days ago, is called Biblical Truths, The Meaning of Scripture in the 20th Century.
21st century.
Sorry. 21st century, yes. That's a brilliant slip. That was my PhD advisor, so you just know, reading your Freud, that I would try to get him at some point, and that was it. I could go on, but I don't want to distract from the main event. Instead, I will say that Professor Martin will speak to us now for about 45 minutes or so, and also that we will have time for questions after the lecture, so hang on to those. And now will you please join me, therefore, in welcoming Professor Dale Martin, who will speak about ancient, biblical, and modern families.
I gave him a copy of the book so he could hold it up, so he could see what color it is and everything, so you could all rush right out and buy it. It just came out last week. I don't think these mics are on, is that right? If you think they're on, I won't shout. But I tend to project anyway. I don't think I need the mics, but I don't want to project myself if it's overwhelming in the microphone. Does that sound all right? Okay, good. There's no such thing in the pre-modern world as the family in the sense of contemporary English. The family is almost all modern Americans think of it usually as the nuclear family of two adults with children. That is basically an invention of modernity. Indeed, of modern capitalism and nationalism. It simply did not exist in the ancient world. Of course, one can find household structures, say in literature, legal texts, or inscriptions, that consist of one man, one woman, and one or more immediate children. But that was not at all the norm for the ancient world or the way up until, say, the 1950s. Moreover, even if the household structure did exist, and of course it did exist at least sometimes in some places, that was not what most ancient people thought was the normal household structure. They did not think of that as the family. Scholars of Greek and Latin and the ancient family are familiar with something most other people don't know. There was no Greek or Latin word that corresponded truly with the modern English word family. The Latin word from which the English is derived is familia. But in Latin, that word did not refer to the husband, wife, and children of a household. Rather, familia referred to the servile members of the household only. The slaves, and sometimes freed persons who were still connected legally and socially to the paterfamilias. The sons and the daughters of the paterfamilias were not part of his familia, at least not generally or according to Roman family law. And the wife was not legally part of even the household of her husband. She remained legally a member of the household of her grandfather, father, or brothers. Familia was the word for the slave members of the household. The Latin word that comes closest to our family is domus, which literally meant a house itself, the building itself. Likewise in Greek, when they wanted to refer to what we might think of as a family, they most often used the Greek word oikos, again meaning a house, or sometimes they'd use a little bit more abstract word, oikia. And again, referring to the house, but having a broader meaning of the household. That is, referring to the people who belonged to the house. That doesn't mean that the people all stayed in the same house structure. They could reside in several different houses or apartments in the town, or in a compound of different structures. The slaves might sleep in the kitchen, the bedroom of another member of the household, in a hallway, or they might occupy rooms in an attic, or separate buildings in town, or even in other towns. That would be particularly true if the slaves were running businesses for their owners, which some did, or if they were hired out as servants or workers to somebody else. No matter where they lived, though, all these people connected to one male head of household were designated as the oikos, or orkia, or in Latin, the domus, the house people. The Latins and Greeks simply had no word that corresponded to what most English speakers today mean by the family. And those household social configurations varied in structure greatly. We can, to some extent, use ancient literature, including fiction, letters, manuals for agriculture, household management, medicine, or dream interpretation, to sketch out how large households were, for example, whether they were what we would call nuclear families or extended families. How many generations they included, and those kinds of questions. But one helpful primary source for studying the extent and makeup of ancient households is in funeral inscriptions, at least of certain types. Most funeral monuments, especially those in Latin from the western part of the Mediterranean, record simply the name of the deceased with ages, or maybe short comments, or maybe designating who provided the inscription. Some record the name of the deceased along with the name of the person responsible for setting up the inscription too. In several publications early in my career, I pointed out the usefulness of funeral inscriptions I call familial or household inscriptions. And these popular in certain geographical areas of the ancient Mediterranean in certain time periods. Someone will say that he or she was providing the tomb for those members of his or her family, household, and then sometimes will list the relations, sometimes along with their names. These inscriptions may not include everyone related to the provider by blood, marriage, or contract, but they at least seem to represent how the providers wanted to present the extent and contents of their households, at least at the time of the setting up of the inscription. The inscriptions, at any rate, many from Asia Minor in the 2nd or 3rd centuries of the Common Era, are often formulaic, but that in itself is helpful for historians because we can treat the inscriptions something like a census list of those people considered, by the person paying for the inscription anyway, to be members of the same household. To give a sense of the basic formula for one kind of inscription, I quote one that represents a nuclear family. Aurelius Mucianus Praetorianus, and I think that may mean that he's a member of a Praetorian cohort, built the tomb for myself and my wife, Aurelia Sabatia, and our children. But it is permitted to no other to bury someone here, or the one forcing entry will pay to the sacred treasury 2,500 denarii. Now that's a basic formula, including the penalty thing and the forbidding of anybody burying somebody else. So I'm not going to read that part of the inscription when I read a couple more here, because that's just the etc. that you see at the end of quotations in my articles and other people's books. Many of the inscriptions, though, become complicated with how many people are allowed burial in the tomb and their relation to the provider. They often include both children and grandchildren. Sometimes they are named and sometimes not. In the case in which the children and grandchildren are not named, it may be possible that the offspring don't yet exist, except in the hopes and aspirations of the householder. But we can see many other people at times included: slaves and sometimes free persons, brothers, sisters, people who may not be slaves but were raised in the household as something like foster children. The Greek is threptoi, and it's very difficult with a lot of Greek familial terms to figure out what exactly kind of role they refer to. But I think threptoi usually means people raised as sort of foster children in somebody else's family. We see sometimes people included whose relationship with the provider we can't discern from the inscription, perhaps meaning that they are just clients or friends. We see men providing for their wives who seem to have started out as their slaves. Men often bought young girls with the intention of marrying them eventually. We see men providing for other single men, perhaps meaning they had a same-sex substitute for a heterosexual marriage. We see combined families. A man named Aurelius Discos II set up an inscription naming himself, his wife Cratea, children whom he does not name, and a man named Epictus, who seems to be a male slave of a woman named Bernice, that is Bernice, who is herself apparently unrelated to Aurelius Discos. But later, maybe after Aurelius Discos died or something, the wife, Cratea, adds an allowance for burial in the household tomb to a man named Seneca, who is a hierodulos, she says, which may mean he may be a sacred slave of some kind of sacred complex. But not only Seneca, the sacred slave, she also includes Seneca's wife, Rhoda, Seneca's son, Helenus, and daughter-in-law, Dracontis, and then last, Rhoda's son, Leon. So since Leon is her son but not his son, Leon may be a child of hers from a previous relationship or a different father. Can't tell from the inscription. This is a complicated social structure. If we may take the inscription to represent a social structure, as I think we can. Its complex extended family, including at least 3 nuclear families. Notice there are 3 what we would call nuclear families in this one household tomb. It includes children, in-laws, and people apparently unrelated to others by blood or marriage, but included in the same familial inscription. Now, I don't want to give the impression that the majority of ancient Greek funerary inscriptions are nearly as complicated and interesting as that one. Most are much simpler. But just to show you the extents to which ancient people could go in constructing complex households, I want to cite one more. This one is by an apparently free woman married to a man who seems to be a slave. But the surprises don't end there. Here's a quotation. Aurelia Rhodus, daughter of Hermaios Dionysodorus, Olympine, now calling herself an Olympine probably means she's a citizen of the city Olympus, which is where this inscription was found, constructed the tomb for myself and my husband Demetrios, and for our children and grandchildren, and for the sweetest previously interred Trophymae. There's one of those words that probably means a woman who was raised as a foster child in her own house. Olympine. Now this is where the word Olympine is actually the proper name of this foster child of hers. And Hermaios Dionysodorus, that's her husband, my father, and my mother Chrysogonia, and for my second husband, Macarius, so now she's got a second husband, and he's called an oikonomos of the ethnos of the Lycians. Oikonomos means he's probably a managerial, bureaucratic slave owned by a public entity, in this case the ethnic group of the Lycians. But to no other, etc. Apparently, though, she later added, I have permitted also to be buried in this, my suntrophos. And that sounds, this is a male term, and it sounds like she's talking about a guy who was a foster child with her. She was a foster child, and he was a foster child, and they both grew up in the same household. That's what it sounds like. His name is Euprepes. He's also called an Olympine, and his wife, Aurelia Olympine. A free woman in the position of the matriarch of the household, who may herself have grown up as a foster child, provides for a former husband, a current husband, who is a public slave, her father and mother, her children and grandchildren, though they're not named and so may not exist, although you kind of wonder, why would she name all these other people, including foster children, and not name her own children and grandchildren if they actually exist? This is one of the reasons I think that sometimes when they say this, they're thinking they may have children and grandchildren at some point. A woman, she includes also a woman who seems to have been a foster child in the matriarch's household, and then later, a man who may have been a foster child with her in their childhoods, and that man's wife. All these persons are presented, at least by the convention of the funerary inscriptions of the area, as members of her large extended family or household. None of this looks like anything modern Westerners mean by the traditional family. And I'm reminded of this whenever I go to a Thanksgiving at my big family in Texas. You know, there's my older brother and his wife and his 3 sons and their 3 wives and their children. Now that's the only traditional part of this family, except for my parents being married to one another. So then there's me, the gay kid in the crowd, who don't have a husband, don't have a wife, don't have any children, don't have any grandchildren. They never know who I might bring home. Then there's my younger brother, who is there with his second, well, he's divorced from his first wife. He wanted to marry his second wife, but she won't marry him, which we think is smart. We say, if you marry him, he'll figure out some way to screw it up, so just keep him on a leash. And that woman's 2 daughters and grandchildren from her previous marriage, and my younger brother's adopted daughter from his first marriage, and her new husband and her 2 children by her previous husband. And then there's my sister, who was in a lesbian relationship for 10 years and has now been with this guy that she's now with for 15 years or so. And his 3 children, one of whom was adopted from Korea, and then 2 of his children by natural childbirth with his previous wife. You know, this is all mixed up, people. And the thing is, more and more of us in this day and age find that we come from households that are kind of like this more than we come from the traditional households. I should also point out that the nuclear family is even less dominant in the ancient world if we note how many households contain only what we would call a partial nuclear family. That is, a couple with no children, one parent with perhaps only 1 or 2 children, brothers being buried together but without other members of their nuclear family, a few slaves or freed persons setting up a funeral inscription for themselves as if they constitute a family. The nuclear families we can locate in antiquity are also often fractured, partial pieces of what may have been nuclear families. The content and constructions of households and families in the ancient world are not at all like what occupies the ideological fantasies of modern Americans. I'll leave it to you to decide about Britons. Although I will mention an article, Cordelia Moise article, Mother's Union, From Victorian Village to Global Village. It's really interesting. It's analyzing these mothers' unions from previous kind of British Empire social contexts. And it's in a book called Anglican Women, edited by Kwok Pui-Lan, and from 2012. So if you want to see at least some of this material, how the family is emphasized ideologically in the Victorian era and 20th century, that's a real good book to look at. If we want a historical survey of the great varieties of ancient families and households, we could do worse than just survey the Bible. From Genesis to Revelation, we discover a remarkable variety of family structures, sizes, and ideologies. At Yale, for a few years, I have taught a lecture course called Sex in the Bible. The students regularly experience something like intellectual vertigo by the end of the course. They find it difficult to get their heads around the many different meanings of family and household have, from prehistorical Near Eastern cultures to the Christian church of the 1st and 2nd centuries, not to mention, because I don't cover it, the vast growth of the monastic movements in the 3rd through 6th centuries. They also are surprised to find out what kinds of sexual and familial relationships seem to be considered by biblical authors as perfectly acceptable and not at all immoral or illegal. Abraham and Sarah seem to have, at least from Abraham's point of view, something of an open marriage. Once, Abraham offers his wife to Pharaoh in Egypt. Having learned nothing from that experience, he later offers her to Abimelech of Gerar. Abraham's son Isaac is a chip off the old block. He later also offers his wife Rebekah, and again to Abimelech. When Abraham and Sarah initially fail to have children, Sarah gives her slave Hagar to Abraham so he can have sex with her and have a son. Abraham's grandson Jacob really puts Abraham and Isaac, though, in the shade in the household creating department. Jacob worked 7 years for the property that will be his first wife, Leah. He then promises another 7 years of work for Leah's sister, Rachel. Leah immediately bears 4 sons for Jacob. Rachel, not at first able to get pregnant, gives Jacob her slave, Bilhah. Jacob has sex with her, and she ends up bearing Jacob 2 sons. Not to be outdone, Leah gives her slave, Zilpah, to Jacob to be his 4th wife. In fact, although we would call her a concubine, the text of Genesis actually calls her a wife, apparently. After apparently lots of sex between Jacob and Zilpah, Zilpah ends up supplying Jacob with 2 sons. Later, Leah bribes Rachel with a bouquet of flowers, so Rachel will let her, Leah, sleep with Jacob again. Apparently, finally returning to an active sex life with Jacob, Leah eventually produces 2 more sons and 1 daughter for Jacob. Finally, God opens the womb of Rachel, and after having sex with Jacob, she personally bears him a son herself. The household is even larger than appears from this list. When Jacob later is nervous about meeting his long-estranged brother Esau, he arranges his whole household to go before him, hoping to assuage any resentments Esau may very well still be harboring against Jacob for all his trickiness earlier in their lives. In this text, therefore, we can take note of the size and makeup of Jacob's household. First, he sends ahead the livestock, numbering, and I counted them, at least 550 goats, camels, cattle, and donkeys. These have to be led by slaves, of course, so Jacob must have had, at this time, a large number of slaves and other kinds of servants in his household. Then he gathers up the other people of the household, 2 wives, 2 slave wives, 11 sons, and although this text doesn't mention it, 1 daughter. Not counting the servile members of Jacob's household, the number of which we don't know, Jacob has a household of 4 wives and 12 children. I usually have to point out about this time that nowhere in the Bible is any of this wife-swapping, multiple wives at the same time. Nowhere is any of this condemned by God, any author of the text, or any character in the narrative. This is all considered perfectly normal, legal, and moral by our Bible's authors, the traditional family. We could say similar things about many characters and scenes in the Hebrew Bible especially. In the book of Joshua, a heroic role is played by a prostitute, Rahab. Rahab first takes in and hides the Israelites Joshua has sent to spy out Jericho. She hides them, lies to the authorities about their whereabouts, and then lets them escape. She betrays her neighbors and townspeople by helping the Israelites break through the city's defenses and destroy the entire city and its population, except for her family. There's no hint in the text that anyone considers prostitution wrong. It may have posed some status problems for some women, perhaps those of high status, but it's not illegal or even something that brought shame or condemnation. The Rahab story certainly plays on her being an outsider with regard to Israel, but not being particularly sinful or degraded. Rahab is later said to be an ancestor of Jesus in the first chapter of Matthew. She is therefore also, according to the first chapter of Matthew, the mother of Obed, the father of Boaz, who marries Ruth. She is thus, Rahab there is thus the grandmother of Obed, who is a grandfather of David, King David. Note also that Rahab really is the hero of the story. We don't even know the names of the two spies. And finally, we should know that even in the New Testament, she is an example of faith in Hebrews 11. I noted that according to Matthew, Rahab was a grandmother of Boaz, who married Ruth. Talk about a traditional family. In the book of Ruth, we start off with an extended family in which two sons and their two wives occupy the same household as their two parents. After the deaths of the males of the family, one of the daughters-in-law returns to her ancestral family. But Ruth stays with her mother-in-law, Naomi. And I'm not the only one who has wondered about a hint of homoerotic hints in the exchanges between Naomi and Ruth. But the real kicker comes when Naomi instructs Ruth on how to seduce her kinsman Boaz. Ruth goes to the threshing floor, which is often emblematic of sexual liaisons in ancient texts and tales. In the middle of the night, while Boaz is asleep, Ruth sneaks in and uncovers his feet. Now we know that feet in Hebrew often euphemistically refers to the genitals, especially male genitals. I'm also not the only one who reads this text as a socially coded story about Ruth seducing Boaz and getting him to have sex with her. Note, again, that nothing in this story takes any of this to be immoral or wrong in any way. In fact, it leads to a happy ending with another extended family, and Ruth eventually becoming also an honored ancestor of King David and Messiah Jesus, the seductress in the ancestral line of the King and the Messiah. And was I speaking of David? David is presented as in his youth as taking a male lover. I don't think there's any question but that an ancient reader of the Hebrew text would have taken the language as implying an erotic relationship between Jonathan and David, including sexual intercourse and penetration, at least, of Jonathan by David. Saul's condemnation, Saul, that's Jonathan's father, King Saul is, his condemnation of Jonathan in his relationship with David is loaded with innuendo. Saul says that Jonathan is shaming himself because of his relationship with David, and his actions shame his mother's nakedness, often a reference to sex. Nakedness being a reference to sex. Now, I'm not an expert in ancient Hebrew sexual innuendo, but Saul's rebuke of Jonathan, combined with the erotic-sounding language exchanged by Jonathan and David, makes it sound to me as if Saul is accusing Jonathan of allowing himself to be used as David's bitch. Several scholars, including Saul Olian and Jennifer Wright Knust, argue that David's poetic insistence that Jonathan's love for him surpassed the love of women makes little sense in the ancient context unless it is a reference to an erotic, physical, sexual relationship. Notice that in none of this are Jonathan and David and their relationship condemned in the text. Of course, David was not what we would consider a homosexual, but there probably were no people in the historical context who would fit our notions of one. David ends up with at least 5 wives, and 6 if you count Saul's daughter, Michal, whom David still considers his wife even after she leaves him and is married to another man. None of that is condemned either. David's early love is with a man but he is also a polygamist. Of course, David can't hold a candle in that department to his son Solomon's expertise. According to the Bible, Solomon was married to 700 princesses and had 300 concubines. Solomon does end up getting into trouble by means of his wives, and his behavior is eventually condemned in the text. But he is not condemned for the number of women he's had. His mistake is in marrying so many foreign wives and then having been seduced to the importation and worship of their various foreign gods. There's a wonderful painting of this in the Yale Art Gallery. It's called King Solomon Sacrificing to the Idols. It's Sebastian Bourdon, 17th century. And it just shows all these women dressed kind of in odd, foreign-looking, orientalized clothing. And then Solomon's this kind of old man who's sprinkled a little incense for these gods. Great painting. The great number of his wives and concubines functions in the Bible as a testimony of Solomon's royal power and masculine role. So far, the texts I've been using to illustrate the structures and ideologies of families and household in the Bible are all narrative texts. But the legal texts in the Pentateuch also offer no support for the modern promoters of biblical traditional family values. There are, of course, differences in the treatment of household and women in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But in all the legal texts, several common assumptions are made. Women are basically treated merely as property of men. Their main function in life is childbearing. Their own men may treat them as basically human property. Men are presented as able to divorce their wives for just about any reason. Men are prohibited only from later marrying their wives again if those women had become the property of another man in the meantime. Prostitution is nowhere outlawed, only slightly regulated. Though women are prohibited from having sex with any man other than their husband, men may have sex with other women as long as, 1, those women are not the property of another man, and 2, those women are not members of certain foreign tribes, prohibited from intermarriage with Israelite men. Again, that is not anything like the romantic traditional family of modern American ideology. Unlike many people's assumptions to the contrary, the New Testament does not offer anything much better. The historical Jesus, in all likelihood, taught some kind of ascetic celibacy, or at least the dismissal of family and household. Jesus of Nazareth probably did teach that divorce of any kind was against the will of God, but if he did so not as advocating marriage, but as simply forbidding divorce. In the ancient world, the assumption would have been that a man divorced his wife only with the intention of marrying another. What Jesus was forbidding, therefore, was divorce and remarriage. That could be taught with complete consistency, along with teaching that the avoidance of marriage was the higher ideal. I think that's clearly what the historical Jesus taught, and I think it's also what Jesus is teaching in Matthew and Mark. That was certainly also the position of the Apostle Paul. And I think it was likely the position of the historical Jesus also. If his followers were not already married, they should leave the households of their parents, join the itinerant movement led by Jesus, and refrain from marriage and producing a family of their own. The Gospels have many stories in which Jesus calls people, especially young men, to desert their familial households in order to join his movement. In one story, Jesus even instructs a potential follower to leave it to his elderly father to bury himself at his death. Or maybe the father's already dead, and the son is wanting to do the secondary burial that would happen a year later after the death. So this suggestion to come follow me and don't bury your father is a suggestion that would have been considered radical and even immoral and, according to Jewish law, illegal by most people of that society. According to a saying in Matthew, Jesus warns his followers against loving their families more than they love God. But in the version of the saying passed along by Luke, Jesus tells them they must hate or despise members of their households, including their wives. This is the version of the saying that may have been had a better claim to derive from the historical Jesus, partly because telling people men to hate their wives is more radical than the version in Matthew, which just says you should not love your wife more than me. Because Matthew would more likely have toned down a more radical rejection of the family, I think, if that is what he found in his source. but also because Luke's is the version also passed along in the Gospel of Thomas, including the term hate and the mention of wives. Wives are not mentioned in this passage in Matthew, just other members of the family. The wives are mentioned, though, in Luke and the Gospel of Thomas, and they both use the word hate rather than do not love more than. I've argued in my book, Sex and the Single Savior. In fact, if any of you have read the book, Sex and the Single Savior, all this is sounding boring and old hat to you. I've argued in Sex and the Single Savior that whereas the Gospels of Mark and Matthew forbid divorce and remarriage, the versions of similar stories from Luke suggest that its author forbade only remarriage after divorce and actually encouraged Jesus' followers to leave their spouses. In the New Testament, Jesus is presented not as a supporter of traditional family values, either those of ancient societies or our own. Jesus is at best ambivalent toward marriage and family, and in places actively opposes the traditional household. Instead, he works to build a movement that will offer an eschatological alternative to household. The Apostle Paul was ambivalent toward marriage. It should be noted that in the letters critical scholars take to be authentically from him, that is, the 7 letters of Paul that almost all scholars believe Paul actually wrote, Paul nowhere shows any concern about children or procreation. When he does address the issue of marriage and sexual relations, he acknowledges that he would prefer all believers to be like himself, single and celibate. This is mainly from 1 Corinthians 7. He permits marriage and sexual relations only so believers may avoid burning. That is, so they may avoid the burning, pollution, that Paul assumes constituted erotic desire. Jesus, much of our Gospels, and Paul are all on record as harboring suspicions of marriage and the traditional household. And I mean the traditional household of antiquity, as well as what people nowadays think of as the traditional household. Of course, there are other parts of the New Testament that support marriage and the ancient traditional household of antiquity. These texts also portray the church as itself a household. The author of Colossians, who was not Paul, but someone who saw himself as a follower of Paul, famously passes along household codes, prescribing behavior of husbands and fathers, wives, children, and slaves. This is certainly not a rejection of the ancient traditional household, but its presupposition, complete with the subordination of women and the submission of slaves. The author of Ephesians, another follower of Paul, not the author of Colossians, but somebody else, who used Colossians as a model for his own letter. In other words, he's reading Colossians. He thinks Colossians is probably by Paul. He probably thinks Colossians by Paul. And he's using what he thinks is Paul's letter to Colossians to write his own pseudepigraphic letter and enlarge upon it. He elaborates and emphasizes even more the subordination of women, children, and slaves. He makes the male patriarch practically an earthly version of Christ. He says, as the church is subject to Christ, so also women should be in everything subject to their men. The slave master is also made parallel to Christ. Slaves are to obey their master not simply as a human master, but as if he were Christ himself. The author of the pastoral epistles, which is what scholars call 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, wrote even later. So this is a third disciple of Paul writing in Paul's name. Again, imitating Paul. Or trying to imitate Paul. He actually doesn't do very well. But whereas Paul showed disinterest in or even suspicion of the traditional household and marriage, this later author attempts to turn the church into a household with patriarchs firmly in charge, women silent and submissive, and slaves properly in their place. Even widows have to be assigned a place in the household of God, either as older registered widows or, for younger widows, in some kind of arranged remarriage, so they won't follow their natural female inclinations to gossip, be busybodies, and in general cause troubles. Note that we discover something of a pattern in these different attitudes toward marriage and the household. Those of Jesus, Paul, and some of our Gospels seem opposed to traditional household structures. They are also the sources in our New Testament that allow a more active and central role for female disciples. Jesus has some important women followers with whom he seems to have trusting and close relationships. Paul recognizes women in leadership roles in his house churches. See especially, for example, Romans 16. This is not to imply that either Jesus or Paul advocated or practiced complete gender equality, but women do seem to have fared better in some communities in the churches than in later Christianity. Yet the other New Testament on the traditional patriarchal hierarchical structure of the household with submissive women and obedient slaves. We find a pattern in much of early Christianity. The more the traditional household is advocated and supported, the less freedom and respect is accorded to women. Conversely, the more early Christians oppose the traditional household, the higher respect and greater activity are allowed for women. This is not a coincidence. There's something rational going on here. The revelation of John is an interesting case in its own right. Note that there are only 4 female figures in Revelation. First is the false prophet called Jezebel by John. This is probably a reference to some female leader of a church condemned by John. The author accuses her of encouraging idolatry within her church, or churches under her influence. Naming her Jezebel links what the author takes to be her tendency to idolatry also to sexual immorality. But the truth could just be that she is a leader in a more Pauline-influenced church, which did allow women leaders. One that allowed also for the consumption of meat that had been sacrificed to idols, and one that did not forbid marriage outright. The second female figure is, of course, the whore of Babylon, meant to represent Rome, probably including the city of Rome, along with her patron goddess, Roma. The whore, of course, encourages idolatry, is accused of prostituting herself with men all around the Mediterranean, and destroying loyal followers of Christ. Another female figure is the mysterious woman who gives birth to the male child, is attacked by the dragon, and is rescued by God. But then she's just hidden away in the desert, not to be heard of again for the rest of the book. Finally, the last female figure in Revelation is the bride of Christ. She is the only truly positive representation of a female figure in the entire book of Revelation. But notice, her person seems populated by all men. The 12 male apostles and the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. In other words, the Messiah is eventually expected to have sex with a bride, but she turns out to be a bride made up of completely male bodies. In contrast to the female figures, Revelation is populated by many and all sorts of males. 4 male beasts, 2 male prophets, Michael, who is a male angel. In fact, it seems obvious that all the angels in Revelation are masculine. And in fact, just as an aside, I've never encountered in my look at ancient Christian and Jewish mythology and angelology, I've never found a female angel in these ancient texts. Maybe there is one somewhere. But either the angels are androgynous, but still kind of more masculine than feminine, or they're just straight out male. And then there are John himself and all his fellow disciples, who are all portrayed as fellow angels with the angels, fellow slaves with the angels, and brothers of one another. But there are also priests, prophets, and even kings. The people this author calls saints, or of course just meaning the holy ones, his people he thinks are real Christians, are all and only males who have, he says, not been defiled or polluted by women. In other words, John's Christian community consists, or at least the community he imagines as the true church, consists only of male angels and celibate and virgin men. That's his ideal church. No marriage or traditional family here. I could lead you through a longer history of Christian opposition to what many modern Christians take to be traditional Christian views of sex, marriage, and family. Elsewhere, for instance, I have examined the Jovinian controversy that took place around 390 to 400. That was the first time that a pope, if you want to call him a pope that early, and several local councils declared it a heresy to consider not marriage as superior to celibacy, but just on an equal level of virtue and heavenly award as celibacy. Pope Siricius, Ambrose, Augustine, and Jerome all declared it heretical to raise sex within marriage to the same level as the virtue of celibacy. And that was the official Christian doctrine until the early modern age. But if you want to see these arguments, you can check it out in Sex and the Single Savior. I do want to emphasize one last point on the history of Christianity, however, because so many advocates of the modern traditional family sometimes say, but certainly assume, that they are in favor of a version of family that was also advocated or assumed by those who established some of the earliest institutions of Christianity in what later became North America. I refer to the Puritans. The Puritan communities of New England did heartily promote the household. But what they had in mind was not at all the nuclear family of more modern imagination. They expected households to include servants, sometimes actual slaves, and apprentices. New England communities were ideologically and officially compositions not of individuals, but of households. They were collections of extended households under the firm rulership of the male head of the household. Single men were generally not allowed to live by themselves or in houses with other single men. They, and of course much more single women, were placed firmly in a patriarchal household led by another man. Moreover, households were not considered private, but were publicly controlled. If a head of household was not conducting his household in a way considered proper to other authorities, that is, the other male heads of households in the town, his household could be disbanded and the various members of it, including himself, parceled out to other households. These households were also completely hierarchical and patriarchal. Needless to say, this is a far cry from the private, at least somewhat more egalitarian nuclear family of modern Christian and secular imagination. Let's end by concentrating on the contrast between pre-modern structures and ideology of the household with modern ideological assumptions about the family among Christians, but also among most non-Christians of at least dominant American society. And here I want to refer to a book that I've worked with the author a good bit on the last couple of years, and it's coming out probably about a year from now from Yale University Press. It's by David Wheeler Reed, who did a postdoc at Yale with me after he did his PhD in Toronto. And he has a book coming out called Sex and Ideology in the Roman Empire, Regulating Marriage, Procreation, and Sexuality. And he basically starts off with the Augustan marriage legislation. And he shows how that is in contrast to developing an emphasis on asceticism in early Christianity, including Jesus and Paul. And he basically says when he ends up in the last chapter comparing this to the language about marriage in the Supreme Court case used by conservatives to argue for the traditional marriage. He says they think they're being Christian, but they line up with Augustus, the Roman emperor, in his values of marriage, not with the early Christians. Conservative Christians may think of the family in terms of the traditional family of one man, one woman, and their children. Liberal Christians may be more open-minded to enlarging that portrait to include other configurations of family, including same-sex marriage, extended families, and other configurations. But American Christians of many different political persuasions still assume that family is one of the most important values promoted by Christianity, if not the most important. One can see this by simply observing that people not in more traditional families are much less likely to attend church than those in traditional families. Most churches are not very welcoming places, perhaps in spite of their intentions, to single people or people in unusual household formations. The problem with putting so much emphasis on the family is that it takes the command to love the neighbor, and it allows the love of one's family to suck up all the love oxygen in society. Karl Barth, therefore, criticized the ideology of the nuclear family. So this is a quotation from Karl Barth. It is the concentration of neighborly love on these persons, that is one's family, which really means its denial. It is the indolent peace of a clannish warmth in relation to these persons, with its necessary implication of Cold War against all others. This fact can be observed in American politics. Those people who most want the state to promote traditional family values are also those who do not want the state to help the poor. If the church is to love as it should, this is me talking now, it must be called out to become the militant church in a post-Constantinian society. It must radically question its worship of the family. That is not Christianity, that's idolatry. Churches need to be places where those without families may find their form of family, as well as the social supports families certainly provide. That is what was taught and modeled by Jesus and Paul. I propose that we use the rich history of Christianity and experience of family and household from other cultures as well, as we could observe them today, and use those things to reform our imaginations and our society to use the church to explore alternative ways of being together. We may imagine the church as the household of God, but if we do so, we also must restructure our minds. We may enlarge the family. We may come up with alternative ways of living together entirely. We may queer the family to better fit a postmodern queer church. But we must not give in to the capitalist, oppressive, clannish, romantic, modern notion of the family. Thank you.
have time now for some questions.
Thank you very much for a fascinating paper, and for what it's worth, I think you're absolutely right in terms of your reading of the misfits between contemporary models of family and conceptions in the ancient world. I've often wondered, actually, what would happen if we were, as a family service, the sort of fixation that a lot of churches seem to have these days on family services, what would happen if you were to use that Lutheran reading about hating your father, mother, brother, and sister for my sake, how that would go down on Mother's Sunday or something like that. But a couple of quick points, if I may, please. First of all, I wondered whether you've extended your thinking to changes in actual marriage rituals and practices, public recognition of relationships in the way that they have significantly changed over that 2,000-year period, and what impact that has had on our modelling of family around that public recognition. And then a second technical point, perhaps on the New Testament. I wondered whether in your masterly presentation of various texts, I was waiting for the dreaded eunuch saying, and wondered what you made of that.
Okay, I'll do those in reverse order. So you may have to remind me of the first question. The unit question, I think, is pretty easy, at least in my mind. I believe what, and we don't know whether the historical Jesus said that saying. It's only in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus could have said it because it's often we take things that sound really radical and would not be invented by his followers and say, well, maybe that's there in the text because the historical Jesus actually said it. But I wouldn't know about that for sure. But in the Gospel of Matthew, I take it what it's meaning is that Jesus is saying, in the resurrection, people will be like angels. That means androgynous. Maybe a masculine tinted androgyny. But they're not going to marry in the afterlife because they won't need to produce children, of course, because everybody's going to live forever. And so they're going to, and he's taking Jewish previous traditions that the resurrected body will be an androgynous body, or maybe a completely male body. Now, I think what he's doing there is just saying, he's introduced by saying, there are people who make themselves eunuchs, and I think he means quite physically, and that the eunuch system, the eunuch represents this androgyny, and then the lack of a need to procreate. He may be saying the lack of a need to have sex, period. But in the ancient world, most people thought of eunuchs as perfectly able to have sex. They just couldn't have children. And so eunuchs often had a bad reputation for being sexually voracious. It's hard to say, does the text mean that you're not supposed to have sex at all, or is it just about procreation? That would be my take on the eunuch passage. That it still is about some kind of androgynous kind of life. The first question is a very good question. I have sometimes talked about the actual rituals of marriage in Greek and Roman society. And although we have texts that show Greek weddings, the legalities of Greek marriage are not understood very well, partly because, of course, there's no Greece at the time. It's just that they're in city-states. So they may have had different legal settings. But in Roman law, though, there was no legality of marriage other than the two people saying, we're married. And so the divorce, they didn't have to do a lot to get divorced either, unless they had a lot of money that they had to divvy up. If one of them said, we're not married, then they were not married. So, so there were ways that being married, and therefore starting your family, was a much looser kind of, less official social contract in the ancient world. At least among Greeks and Romans. Jews may have been somewhat different. Seems like they are, looking at Tobit, for example, which is a book that is the first reference to a marriage contract in Judaism. But I'm not an expert on those things, and so I really haven't gotten into it. I know something about the ancient world, but I've not felt smart enough or knowledgeable about enough of the rituals of marriage to actually publish anything on it. What I really love to see is a historical tracing of that, because the only thing I've read about sort of more medieval marriage practices were basically what I read in the otherwise, very suspicious book by John Boswell on same-sex marriages in the medieval period. When John Boswell was talking, he was a Yale professor, I knew him, respected him, but whenever John was talking about stuff in the New Testament, I usually could see where he was wrong, which made me think, is he right when he's talking about material that I don't know anything about? But I would love to see a more sweeping social, cultural history of the rituals of marriage and the legalities of it. But I've never done it. Yes?
Perhaps the origins of monogamy in Christianity and the nuclear family actually arises from syncretization with Anglo-Saxon custom. As Anglo-Saxons typically, the language terms for the family in Anglo-Saxons did denote more nuclear structure. And indeed, traditionally speaking, the nuclear family was mostly practiced in the south of England, predominantly until later on, where it became much more a global affair.
Oh, so you're saying that
Syncretization
not the,
of
so the emphasis on the nuclear family and monogamy, did you also say monogamy?
also monogamy was more Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah, well, that would be an interesting thing to pursue. I don't know the area. One of the things, if you do that though, you'd have to then also explain the Puritans then, who are obviously deriving from English sources.
They were radicals against England. They were often exiled from England.
Yeah. So, but that doesn't mean they weren't Anglo-Saxon.
That does mean, however, they would have deviated from the norms.
Well, they do deviate from the norm, but I would say as far as having large families, they don't. I mean, look at Cromwell, Thomas Cromwell. Look at Wolsey. Look at Cranmer. They're not Puritans, and they all have large households. That include servants and clients and.
True, but only one wife.
Well, sort of. they were screwing around with more than one.
Well, humans are full of sin.
Yeah. No, I don't think that legal monogamy is clearly something that develops before the modern world.
It seemed to be fairly present in southern England during the early medieval period as well.
I'll take your word for it. I actually consider that the modern world. Somewhat the modern world. But yeah, I'll take your word for it. I don't know anything about that. I believe, though, the current structure of the nuclear family, as we experience it in our country, is a product of capitalism. And so, and I don't think full-blown capitalism exists back then. So I would still put I want to make capitalism as a strong social force in the construction of the American nuclear family.
Perhaps just add to that very quickly. It seems to me that you could be constructing an argument perhaps that the family that you were describing at the Thanksgiving event that you were at is in a sense a reversion to earlier models of relationship. And that it's actually what is being presented as the sort of the nuclear family norm is actually the aberration in terms of history.
Oh yeah, in fact I think the nuclear family is much more dominant ideologically in American culture than sociologically.
Could I speak in the question? I mean, so some of the people in the audience have been a part of a course that we teach, which is focused a lot on the question of the relationship between various aspects of something like a kind of nascent political theology in and around the reign of Augustus, as a sort of feeder for a lot of various aspects of early Christian ideology later. And I wonder maybe to pick up on that, so you present a couple of examples of early Christian movements as sort of, I don't know, seceding from or resisting a kind of Augustan rhetoric about the family. Could you say a little bit more about that? I mean, what does that feel like, say, in first century Galilee? I mean, and I think I would have two questions, and one is like, but their neighbors, I mean, Jesus' neighbors presumably would have felt also that it was their family, rather than just say Augustus or something like that. So one question is, what's the relationship between their resistance to just like what people were doing in first century Galilee to what people were saying rhetorically and in terms of various legal structures in Rome?
I don't think there was much. I mean, I think Jesus occupies a village, a rural and village cultural and society, and what the resistance he would be offering would be to traditional kind of Jewish village life, and those kinds of larger student families, like some of these inscriptions might represent those kinds of things. I don't think anybody in Galilee of Jesus' social station would be paying much attention to Roman family law. Roman family law, that's all Augustus was promoting, see, never was applicable to anybody but Roman citizens. And the Romans never cared about other people's family lives. So when Augustus was doing that, he was trying to get the upper class and the plebs of Rome to produce more children for the Roman legions. That's one of the things he was trying to do. And so it didn't, in fact, Paul, I actually don't, I have suspicions. I don't think Paul may have been a Roman citizen after all, despite what the book of Acts says. So I don't think Paul would have felt a tension with Augustan marriage legislation. I don't think it would have been relevant for him. And it certainly wouldn't for most early Christians of the first century, because very, very few of them would have been Roman citizens. The only people who could have possibly said, is there some kind of conflict between this kind of growing ascetic movement within the early Christian movements, and there was different ascetic movements, even if you don't have full-blown monasticism. The only place where that could have been felt, I think, would be in Rome itself, which has several different house churches. And they might have seen some, propaganda about the Augustan marriage laws. But I kind of doubt it, because there again, I don't see them as Roman citizens for the most part. And I don't see them as high enough class that is well off enough to even bother about Roman family law. I do think that it becomes an ideological battle in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when you have an increasingly powerful monastic movement within early Christianity. And I think this is actually what's going on in the different Acts of the Apostles in the 2nd century. When Thecla comes to town, and she hears Paul saying, "Don't get married, don't have sex. Your body will not be resurrected at the end of time, even if you get married." Period. And so she breaks off her engagement. But she's upper class. She's engaged to an upper class man, and they go to the magistrate and they say, "This guy's doing something illegal." That's in the 2nd century. You get this conflict starting off between the monastic movement of Christianity and upper class men in Greek and Roman situations. And that's reflecting that tension. But I don't think you get that until the 2nd century, because I don't think you have enough Christians who are that high in society to make it an issue. Yeah.
Yep. One of the stories you were telling was the story of where the past is a different country and they do things differently there. But you were also telling a story about how the Bible is deliberately strange and deliberately perverse. And I was thinking about the story of Hagar. Right at the first family, you don't just have a story that's reflecting the complexity of a different society. You have a matriarch who's barren, and then you bring in a woman called Hagar, the resident alien, to be this kind of necessary supplement or a surrogate. And you mentioned several moments in the New Testament, which is actually, the same kind of movement, a really sort of perverse, deliberately strange family. I just think that these stories are they have such kind of radical potential, and yet they're forgotten. What can we do? This idea that actually these, I'm very convinced that the story of Israel is deliberately being told as we were the second comer, we were the wrestling twin, we don't even know which is the right line, we were so like the Egyptian alien, we can't even tell the difference. That is a very weird origin story, and the Christian story is differently strange. How can we bring these stories to bear in modern politics and contemporary questions?
Well, I think I was kind of deliberately telling this narrative as if the whole Bible is kind of flat text. you know, I was, for example, when I told all the stories about how many times Abraham did this to Sarah and didn't, you know, Isaac, his son, does it, you know, a good form critic would just say, oh, well, these are different tales that happen to be put together. That doesn't mean it actually happened 3 times. I'm deliberately trying not to do the historical form critical thing, because I'm trying to present the text as a narrative text, or as a sexual morality text for people, like most people, who just want to read it at one level. But if you wanted to go, I kept also thinking, now, I would do this very differently if I'm thinking about the disruptions of the literary text on other kinds of values, like the second overtaking the first. This happens over and over and over again. And I think that, you know, one thing that occurred to me, I mean, you're the expert in the Hebrew Bible here, so it just occurred to me that to think, but regardless of what these stories meant in their pre-biblical context, sometimes they almost sound like just like trickster stories, or you know, Jacob is this trickster, he fights with God. I imagine some of this stuff is just being, what, in a prehistoric kind of situation, what stories would you like to tell about our forefather Jacob and Yahweh? Well, they got in that fight one night. And that might be its meaning, but then as you were talking, I kept thinking, well, does it matter that these stories are put together at a time when Jews, I take it most of this is post-exilic, put together, when they see themselves as second-class citizens in relation to stronger societies, either Babylonia or Persia or Assyria or the Hellenistic kingdoms and then Rome. Are they dealing with, is it a strange origin story for an ethnicity and nation precisely because it's post-exilic? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, but I think that there's also, I mean, I don't know of origin stories, these twin stories, you can see analogies elsewhere, but you don't quite have the one where one twin, they battle down the birth canal, one twin puts his hand out first, gets the red cord around it, and then the other one fights past. So which one is first? You really don't know.
Right.
And I think it's almost like a comic origin story, like who are we?
Yeah.
And Hagar as well, you know, sort of recension history of art. You know, you've got this deliberate kind of, she was first, Ishmael was first, and she's an Egyptian, and she's Hagar. It seems like you're deliberately messing with the family.
Yeah,
I think it does connect to context.
Yeah, I think also that, especially the Hebrew Bible, more than the New Testament, is such a complex and puzzling text in so many ways that there are so many different things you can do with it. The Hebrew Bible, from what it doesn't, it goes even less than a lot of other ancient texts. It doesn't interpret it itself for you. You have to deal with tons of problems in these texts. And therefore, I think that's a great thing, because I think that means we can do a lot of stuff with this. So we can use these texts to talk about nationalism, hierarchy, gender, all kinds of things. So I wouldn't want to say, I don't know that I have an answer for what to do with that, except to say, let's play around with these texts more and see where we can take them. But that does show that what I was doing today is kind of flattening all that out in kind of a curious way. Because I was trying to do this contrast narrative of ancient, biblical versus modern. Yeah.
Ben, thanks for a really interesting, stimulating paper. I'm going to say something that people don't normally hear me say, which is, I want to talk about Jesus. You reflected upon his attitude to familial relations. As I understood it, you were presenting it as a kind of two-leveled approach, which was the best option is if you're not married and not doing so, but then allowing for the possibility that many followers might be married already in that kind of situation. And I want to draw a comparison as part of my question with the Buddha, because the Buddha also expressed a kind of two-level approach to the question of celibacy in particular. There was his early followers and the emphasis upon celibacy and so on. But of course, an acceptance that there's a difference of intensity of practice or discipleship, and that there will be many lay followers over time who have lots of commitments and so on. Now, in the case of the Buddha, in expressing that view, he was not expressing anything particularly innovative, because he was expressing it from a context where he was in a social milieu of ascetic renouncer movements. How, this is my question, how distinctive do you think Jesus' view was in the first century Galilee in which he lived?
Good question. I don't think he was alone, and if I may just be general about it, in advocating ascetic behavior. Although I think the historical Jesus would be kind of curious, because I think he was probably advocating ascetic behavior when it came to sexuality, or at least marriage and family. But I don't think he was advocating asceticism when it came to food and drink. And not finding one of those when you find the others, that's unusual in the ancient world. But I don't think that he would have been in a minority, clearly. And in some ways, the saying about hating your wife and not bearing your father, because the not bearing your father actually goes against the Ten Commandments. They would have been seen as breaking the honor of thy father and mother commandment. And that's big doings among Jews in antiquity. But other than that, I think the general asceticism, although a minority position, was not, he was not completely innovative, because I think you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think John the Baptist was an ascetic, and Jesus started out as a disciple of John the Baptist, I think, pretty sure. We have from Josephus' writings some other prophets who would exist around the time of Jesus, some of whom were kind of pushing some kind of asceticism. So I wouldn't say it's, I don't know enough about the Buddha situation, but one thing occurred to me when we were talking about that is that all I know about Buddhism I get from Phyllis Granoff, and my colleagues who teach it. Some people have talked about there being a military kind of background from which some of this derives. Now that I think is interesting, because I take Greek and Roman asceticism, which precedes, in my view, Christian asceticism, as taking its inspiration from military kinds of behaviors also. In other words, well, ascesis means training, exercise. And so I think that, and the way Paul even talks about ascesis, he uses military metaphors. So I think that, I've heard that the Buddhist stuff sometimes itself also has inspiration from military societies and cultures. But you'd have to tell me whether that's true or not. But on how odd was Jesus? A bit odd, minority, but not unique.
There's another bit there perhaps about Jesus, John the Baptist, these scenes, or whoever they might be, or the Qumran communities in it, whether or not they are in breach of another one of the commandments, the first commandment from the rabbinic count, go forth and multiply.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an interesting, there's an unanswered question, it seems to me still, despite the work of people like William Noser and so on, there's a huge gap in understanding how first century Palestinian Jews could handle that commandment to procreate.
Yeah. I think that in Judaism, there's always these tensions between a developed, and I don't see most of the Hebrew Bible as being much ascetic at all. I think what I see as asceticism is something that really comes up in the Hebrew Bible. Maybe the first time you see it is Daniel, but that wouldn't be an accident if Daniel was written in around 164, because by then Judaism has itself become very influenced by Hellenism, and I see Judaism, asceticism coming into Christianity and Judaism, at least the kind of thing I see in the New Testament, as coming mainly from Hellenism first. So, but I think you've always got these tensions of procreation. Now, I wouldn't want to bring the rabbis in, see, because I take it that rabbinical literature develops much later, doesn't reflect first century Judaism, and is itself a direct reaction to Christianity. And I think rabbinic notions of the family and sexuality and procreation are an absolute rejection of Christian monasticism. Precisely because Christian monasticism is such a hugely important late antique social force.
Two of our PhD students, Jeremy Kloss and Taylor Weaver, have kindly put out some nibbles and some drinks. I suggest that given that there's a lot to discuss and a lot of people to meet, we take our conversation there. The atrium is a little bit chilly, and when I first came in, the lights were still off out there. So we'll see how it goes. It's not our first choice for a place to congregate, but nevertheless, we'll do what we can. Because I'm keen for everybody to have a chance to chat, so do make yourselves at home. For now, will you please join me in thanking Dale Morris for an excellent lecture.